Welcome, everyone. So delighted to be here. Let's wait a minute so people can log in and join the session. You can grab a cup of tea, maybe, grab a glass of water, because this is going to be a great discussion. We're going to be speaking about the future of work. If you're tuning in, welcome. Give us a few seconds to get started. We just want to make sure that people have a bit more time to join the session. I'm going to take a sip of tea in the meantime. Okay, I think that should be enough time. Hello, everyone. The session is titled The Future of Work. What new skills will the future of work demand? How apropos and a topic after the 2 years that we've had. Here are some statistics that you might find interesting. It's estimated in Canada that 1 in 5 employees are in an occupation at high risk of automation. And according to the World Economic Forum, we'll need to reskill more than 1 billion people by 2030 for the fourth industrial revolutions. The skills that we need to be successful in today's workforce are constantly evolving. I've certainly found that with the pandemic, and even prior to the pandemic. And technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotics are transforming the way we work. As we watch the workplace drastically change and see new smart technologies emerge, we wonder what skills, education, abilities, experience, and knowledge make someone more employable today and in the future. My name is Manjula Selvaraj. I'm a national columnist to the CBC, and so pleased to be your moderator for the day, for this panel. Let me introduce the panel I have. Pedro Barata is the Executive Director of the Future Skills Center. Wendy Sukir is the Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy and founder of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University. Shamira Madwani is the Managing Director and Deputy Executive Director at World Education Services. And Ro Thomas is the Executive Director at the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Angela.
And are we ready to get into this? Because this is a complex topic. There's been so much written on it. There are books coming out on it. I've seen, 2 documentaries on it. There's a ton of material because I think, this was important before, but the pandemic has really sort of made this top of mind. So I'm going to go through, first of all, I want a rapid answer from each of you. For this particular question, and I'm going to start with you, Rode. In one sentence, tell me what surprised you the most through the pandemic about transformations in the world of work.
Yeah, thanks for the question. What really surprised me was the uptick in the embracement of entrepreneurship. Within my social circles, I've seen a lot of Indigenous artists move towards entrepreneurship within the past year and a half. So that's been really surprising.
Entrepreneurship, I like that. Wendy?
I think the extent to which the pandemic drew our attention to inequality and the way it exacerbated our awareness of the problems women face in the workplace, Indigenous peoples in the workplace, racialized Black employees in particular. I think it really drew our attention to those issues in a way we've not seen before.
Oh, most certainly. We could really see those fault lines, right? Yeah. Pedro.
Just to build on that, I'm really surprised that we seem to be coming out of this with a newfound focus on quality of work, semicolon, because prior to the pandemic, we had seemed to lost our backbone or just have given up on the fact that a job should be a pathway out of poverty. And we have come out of this actually with increased minimum wages, renewed focus on employment standards. So hopefully that principle that a job should be a pathway out of poverty, people are going to work hard, they're going to be able to make a living. That's something that positive that comes out of this pandemic.
Shamira.
Sure. And again, building on what Wendy and Pedro have talked about, what has been great from my perspective is that immigrants did not get left behind. So although we have the inequality issues and the issue of low quality jobs and where they're working, what I worried about is that employers would basically not consider immigrants as part of rebuilding, and they were not left behind. the conversation continues and there's a labor shortage with respect to, where we're going in the future of work. So that to me basically gave me hope that as we're moving forward, that we will be looking at immigrants as a way to build our economy.
And I'm going to come back to that because I think that is actually a big topic. We could actually have a session just on that. But let's look at trends that we saw before the pandemic, accelerate through the pandemic, and ones that are emerging. Wendy, let me start with you. What are some of those things that you are seeing that you think are transforming or have the potential to transform the world of work?
Well, digitization is the obvious one. I've worked in the tech sector for more than 30 years, and many of the things we talked about in the early 1980s, telecommuting, online learning, telehealth, for example, have faced many barriers in their adoption over the last decades. And we saw organizations move so quickly. They did in weeks what we thought would take years to happen. So whether you look at digital health, whether you look at the delivery of education, whether you look at remote work, even in organizations like government, which said we could never do this. If you look at online retailing, if you look at the impact that had on many small businesses, just to Rhoda's point, Indigenous small businesses export more than other small businesses in Canada. And we saw many entrepreneurs actually expand their markets globally because they went online. At the same time, it's a double-edged sword. And the inequality around access to internet also became very, very apparent. So we know half of the Indigenous population live in remote locations, often don't have running water. So it's not surprising they also don't have access to high-speed internet. And even in the city of Toronto, 42% of racialized families can't afford high-speed internet access, and their kids are doing homework on smartphones. So again, we saw incredible acceleration of the adoption of technology, but we saw greater divides, I think, than we've ever seen before as a result.
Yeah, I think that is interesting that sometimes you think of communities outside of the city as having these problems, but certainly we certainly heard from parents, we heard from people that were using libraries and didn't even have access to libraries to have that kind of connectivity. That is so true. And connectivity was such a key thing, throughout the pandemic. I would even say as late as last month. Pedro, I would love to hear you weigh in. What are some of the emerging trends that you're seeing?
So Wendy picked the shift to a digital economy, which is certainly the biggest one of all. But I'll pick one that might be just as important, especially as we've come out of COP and that process of seeing our leaders not really make any grandiose commitments in terms of climate change, but certainly point the way to a more of an incremental approach that gets us to a shift to a green economy. And I think in Canada, we're certainly seeing that already through some major investments through the federal government, and just seeing a mindset, which is about beginning to think about what is it that we can do through our economy to get ahead of the curve and hopefully put Canada on a world stage when it comes to being leaders in the green economy. And it's interesting because I did some work with Wendy at DI and the Conference Board of Canada to look at the next 10 years and the changes in economic sectors and which ones were likely to go up and which ones were likely to go down. And as I've been reflecting on COP and the shift to a green economy, it's interesting because when you think about the sectors where there's going to be the greatest disruption as a result of technology, where we really need to put an emphasis on, especially mid-career reskilling, it's sectors like construction, hospitality, agriculture, and manufacturing. I think those were 4 of the 5, Wendy, that we identified as being the most likely to be disrupted. And when you look at those 4 sectors, and you think about those sectors from the point of view of a shift to a green economy, there are actually huge opportunities as long as we're forward thinking about it. Think about manufacturing. Yes, there's going to be a huge change in manufacturing because of automation. But there's also going to be a huge need, right, around green tech, right, sustainable technology. Think about something like hospitality, a sector that has been hard hit. The recovery looks uncertain but inevitable. What direction that will take, who knows? But there is likely to be more and more of a focus on ecotourism, on a local tourism. And what are the opportunities that we need to really focus that industry on? Same thing with agriculture and sustainable food production, right? Same thing with construction and a shift to green building and more green technologies. So I think that this shift to a green economy is going to have profound implications for so many sectors and so many industries. And it's really important that both as leaders in those industries, as well as policymakers, that we anticipate that it's not all going to be doom and gloom in some of these sectors. There are actually going to be opportunities, but we've got to be smart about seizing those opportunities.
So, we've talked about there are these sort of emerging technologies and emerging notions and actually policies that mean that work has to change, like the commitments that we've made before COP26 and COP26. So let's now talk about the labor force, because I was telling someone that that something as simple as when I go on a road trip and we try to stop off at a restaurant, and I see signs everywhere telling me that be patient. We're down to 2 members of our staff, down from 10. I mean, that's just what I visibly see. But as a journalist, when I talk to people in different sectors, they also tell me about the struggle to get talent. Wendy, Pedro, I'd love for you to give us a sense of what are the changes that you're seeing in the labor force. And I know that one of you is going to say shortfall for sure.
It's interesting. I think that one of the things we have to be very cautious about is thinking that we can predict the future, because as you know, before COVID, there was a lot of talk about automation and the impact automation was going to have on job loss and so on. And I believe that automation will result in job changes. I'm less convinced it will result in job losses. And the big factor that we have to consider is the structure of the economy. Are those different sectors Pedro mentioned, and technology adoption? Because we've seen historically, having a technology doesn't mean it will actually be used. And so what's interesting to me is coming out of COVID, we're not seeing massive unemployment, which was predicted, or massive demands for more highly skilled workers. We're seeing acute shortages of even unskilled basic labor. And, we've been doing some work through the Future Skills, for example, with small, medium enterprises. And they are saying things, and this is almost verbatim. 2 years ago, we expected someone to have 2 or 3 years experience. We were looking for high levels of English language. We really didn't think about hiring diverse people. Now, we'll take anyone who shows up for an interview, because 2/3 of the people we call in don't bother coming. And so the power balance between employers and job seekers, I think, has shifted dramatically. We've had large employers, and Shamira knows we're working on looking at innovative approaches for refugees and newcomers. We've had large employers come and say, please, can you give us 5,000 Afghan refugees? We have jobs across the country. So it could be that it's a transition, and it could be that 5 years from now that's going to flip again. But my optimism around the opportunities, and to echo some of the things that Shamira referenced, is that suddenly I think employers are coming to us and saying, we need talent. Please show us how to find immigrants. Please talk to us about innovative programs. We'll take people who don't speak English very well, and we'll train them. Please find us people. And that's profoundly different than the situation we were in or what the pundits were predicting before the pandemic.
Yes, and that's so interesting that you say that. You're so right. I forgot what people were saying in March and April, and how drastically different the situation is now. Pedro, I'd love for you to weigh in about some of the changes that you're seeing in the labor force, or you think we may be seeing in the labor force soon.
Well, I think Wendy points to something which is quite concerning around employers knowing that they have an issue when it comes to talent, and potentially opens up opportunities for us to break some of the traditional silos that have kept various sectors apart and get us working more closely together. Mm-hmm. And just to give you a figure that to me is really worrisome, but at the same time is a call to action. The KPMG latest survey on CEO priorities, of course, identified that talent, recruitment, and retainment is one of the top 3 issues for today and the future. CEOs say retaining talent and recruiting it is my number 1 priority, or one of 3. And then when you ask them, do you plan to actually make investments when it comes to that HR function? Less than 1/4 say that they plan to. Even more problematic, the companion KPMG survey around HR leads for Canada's largest employers also asks how comfortable or easy or straightforward is it for you to implement an upskilling agenda? And it's a minute number, right, that is actually prepared to do that with no additional resources and with the level of disruption that's happening and more people moving to hybrid model. So clearly we know we have a challenge, but we also are not really in a position, for whatever reason, to invest strictly through the employer in solutions. There's a huge opportunity here for us to mobilize the existing education, training, skills development world to be much more aligned with employer needs, so not even employer needs, the needs of the economy and the needs of workers as well, who are going to be looking for what's my next move? How do I stay ahead of the curve? Wendy and us recently did a survey with Environics of Canadians about their knowledge about career advice and guidance. Career advice and guidance is essentially, before you even think about what kind of training or education or reskilling you're going to do, you take a step back, right? And you think about, what do I already bring to the table? What are going to be some of the changes that are going to be happening in the economy? Where are the trends moving? And therefore, how do I start to think about my reskilling journey and what is my next move? 3/4 of Canadians have not had any kind of career advice and guidance, right? In the past 5 years. And the vast majority don't think they need it. To me, that's a problem. And that's a problem that we need to fix, because if we want to build a culture of lifelong learning, ongoing adaptation, if we want people to be confident that through all of these changes, they know where to turn to for support, that they can get those supports, then we have to shore up this notion that there's going to be a place for you to go to get some support and help you with your next move. And right now, I think that's a missing element in how we're approaching education and training. But the fact that we're all identifying that, right, as a gap, including private sector leaders, business leaders, I think provides us with an opportunity to start to make some headway in that respect.
And that's certainly a problem that will need some fixing. Shamira, I know that Pedro and Wendy have laid out some of the issues that we have with the transformations, but at the same time, the labor force. What role do you see immigrants playing in the future? What gaps will they fill?
Sure. So, building on what Wendy and Pedro have said, we do have skill shortages, but there is a difference between skill shortages and labor shortages. Labor shortages are happening all over the place, from, frontline hospitality to, Amazon delivery, etc. Skill shortages are very different. Skill shortages are where you need particular kind of expertise in order to be able to think about what the future looks like in the labor market. So I just wanted to put that on the table.
Yeah.
With respect to the labor market, we're talking about it in a very generic fashion, and Rod will add to this after I will, in terms of the Indigenous and First Nation communities. Immigrants have long been contributors to our labor market. And in fact, what we do know is that basically, they will make up 100% of our net labor growth, because our demographic profile is very different. We have more people retiring than young people coming into the system. We have fewer children, even as immigrants, when they come here, they end up having fewer children. So what you have is this shrinkage in terms of, the labor market and who's coming in. Then we have basically 1 million immigrants who've arrived over the last 3 years. So what government has done is every year we get approximately 300,000 immigrants. Out of the 300,000, fully 60% are what they call economic immigrants. And these are individuals who are very highly skilled, globally trained. They would have BAs, MAs, PhDs. And so when they come here, what ends up happening is that they are desperately looking, trying to get relicensed, get back into their occupations. The skills are not recognized, so they will just take any job to survive, and they'll make sure the kids will survive. And so you end up with a situation in terms of the pandemic. I started with, we didn't leave them behind, which is great. And now we are saying, well, desperate, we'll take them just because as long as they show up and do the work, it's great. But where are they sitting actually? What I see when I think about what's happening in Canada is you have a lot of highly skilled individuals who were born and trained here, and those who are coming from overseas who are resilient, smart, and they're working in the hospitality sector, restaurant sector, just to survive. And so to me, when we talk about the future of work, we've got to really think about what that looks like for individuals who are coming here, are highly skilled, trained, experienced, and how do we leverage the skills that they bring so that we don't end up basically bringing people in and then totally discounting what they can contribute to the labor market. So when we think about the green economy as an example, that's a really great example around where immigrants could contribute their skills. And this is where I believe that employers have to play a very significant role. They can't just say, I can find them. How do you get intentional around if your labor shortages, how do you meet individuals halfway through to understand how their skills could be pivoted into something that the employers need rather than go back to school, figure it out, we'll decide whether you're going to make it or not. So anyway, you can tell that I'm passionate about this subject. And as you started, this could be a separate topic in itself. But I really do believe that we shouldn't basically treat a very significant group by putting them into jobs that are not valuing their skills, lower wages, and it just impacts their self-confidence and you lose that generation, which doesn't make sense for Canada or our provinces.
Certainly. I mean, other than the fact that this is what allows them to have a good life, but it's also the idea of all of those missed ideas and missed opportunities. Now, you've spoken about how the workplace can change to leverage them, but what can they do to make sure they're positioned for this transformation?
So, a few things as I was thinking about the question. One is that people have to realize, and we've been saying this for 20 years, Wendy and I've been in this field for 20 years, is, painting a realistic picture around what it takes to come here. You have a huge disconnect between, government selling the whole concept of, hope, and you're going to come here and you get points for certain things, including, what they call human capital. And then when you arrive here, the doors are shut because there aren't the necessary tools to assess skills. So I think that we've got to be realistic with individuals. It's going to take long. And, the other side of that is governments and others could start thinking about especially leveraging the pandemic and digitization to start thinking about skills assessment and preparing where people are still overseas as they start the process. So that's the first. The second is basically influencing public policy. Governments at all levels have to think outside of the box. We talk about digitization. What I'm perceiving digitization looks like is you just move from manual to basically doing things on computers. But we're not thinking about, for example, using virtual technology to test somebody's skills. So, just thinking differently. And thirdly, helping people understand that they might have been in an occupation in their home country, but the future of work is changing. And so how do you pivot? How do you create pathways? So if you do have, for example, an engineer from a particular country, and there aren't that many engineering jobs because everything has been digitized, could they build, for example, engineering apps? Or somebody who is in the health profession thinking about using their skills and their global thinking and experience to build apps that will help newcomers in the culture and language that they understand. So really, those are the three different components in terms of how we could start thinking about the box post-pandemic.
Oh, lots of great ideas there. Thank you. Rhode, if we could talk about Indigenous communities and the transformation with Indigenous communities. Your organization is on a mission to address the underrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian technology and innovation sectors. What do you think can be done to ensure that Indigenous peoples and their communities and Indigenous communities are positioned as we brace for this big change?
Yeah, so the mission of CIT is really only one step of the work that Indigenous communities will, or that we will be doing to support and empower the sovereignty of Indigenous communities, especially through data sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
So, so really the key, I think, to the success of ensuring these communities are well positioned is surrounded around education on multiple fronts. So for Indigenous communities, it's really about education on what I mean when I say data sovereignty, because it's really a fundamental piece of self-governance. While the term itself is relatively new, its underlying principles actually aren't new to Indigenous communities, because it's really about the ownership, control, access, and possession of community data, or if I were to use like previous terms, traditional knowledge or community knowledge, which can include many things like language, ceremonies, traditional laws, and all of this has been in existence for forever, really. And so the only thing that's changing is the medium that this information is stored on. So whereas before it used to be mnemonic devices such as wampum belts or totem poles, birch bark scrolls, now it's data servers. So really, yeah, I think education on this for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities is really important. And to exemplify like the potential challenges or problems is having a younger generation of Indigenous youth utilizing social media platforms and posting traditional knowledge or traditional ceremonies and not really stopping to question who actually owns that data once they do post it. So yeah, I think once CIT achieves its mission of education and skill building, Indigenous people can begin to start implementing their own data sovereignty initiatives unique to their own community, and really sky's the limit from there, I think, on the future of work, because it really builds upon what Wendy was saying earlier, in that really a lot of jobs are really just transitioning to a digital space. So my perspective from this is really centered around functions of government. So what and First Nations have their own levels of government. So how does that transition into a digital context? And then really, yeah, again, what other elements of first our Indigenous society can be worked towards there? Because here in Ontario, First Nations communities already own and operate their own educational institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the next step would be exploring the creation and management of our own sovereign financial institutions, and what potentially like a community-owned digital currency would look like. And then that would lead into the fintech space and more jobs there. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because some of the things that you've talked about, and I think also what you mentioned at the start of the conversation was about seeing entrepreneurship bloom, or people rediscover or try new ways of being entrepreneurs. Sometimes I think that if the system can't meet you, then you create what you need, right? Which is what some of the ideas that you've just said, the idea of digital currencies and Indigenous owned and run banks. I'm just wondering, what role do you see, as opposed to people working for larger companies and established workplaces, what role do you see for innovation and entrepreneurship in that change and fueling that within Indigenous communities?
I think the role I see is really kind of the decentralization of work. From my own personal experience, I know I entered a corporate job previously, a summer job, and it wasn't the experience that I necessarily gravitated towards. And kind of like social entrepreneurship is really the realm that I gravitated towards. And so yeah, and seeing Indigenous entrepreneurs within the past year and a half start up their own digital businesses, with like selling their own like digital art or beadwork and stuff like that, or even switching to professional services, just on their own, like of their own, it's their own venture. So yeah, I think decentralization of work and really centering it on helping community as well.
Well, it's interesting because it also means that decentralization, if they do it with their workplaces, then it would be wonderful if they could also leverage other organizations that are doing that. As an example, a bank that is Indigenous found and run. I think that's such an interesting concept. That's another topic for a longer discussion at some point. But coming back to this idea of future jobs, Wendy, I'll start with you here. What are some of the skills that you think are needed for future jobs? What are the skills that you think will be in high demand?
Again, it's interesting because I've worked in the IT sector for a really long time, and we've done projections of the number of computer scientists that are required, and so on. And digital skills for sure are only going to grow. But what those digital skills are, that's part of the challenge. And a lot of times when you say digital skills, people think, oh, more computer scientists, more engineers. Of course, we need more computer scientists and engineers. But as Shamir knows, 45% of internationally educated engineers are underemployed in Canada. So we have some real issues with employment practices that we have to grapple with. It's not just about fixing the job seekers. We really have to work with employers to get them to think, stop looking for skills in all the wrong places. So, but take digital skills. Again, prior to the pandemic, everyone was saying computer scientists, AI, machine learning, PhDs. When you dug into what employers actually need when they say we want digital skills, about 10% are programming jobs. 15% are use of advanced platforms like SAP, ERP, data analytics, where you don't necessarily have to be a computer scientist, but you do need some specialized training. 75% Microsoft Office and Excel, right? So even when we talk about digital skills, there's a lot of confusion, I would argue, in the workplace. And the other piece then is, so often employers will say they want a computer science degree. The federal government has a class of employee called computer scientists. When you dig into what those jobs actually require, in my mind, the most in-demand skill are for people who understand how organizations work and their processes and how to match technology to them. Doesn't necessarily require a computer science degree. And what we're seeing with a lot, even the advanced technology companies like Shopify, are starting to really question what the credentials are that are required to do the job. And, if we think, for example, about Indigenous communities, there's some really innovative startups like Jelly Academy, Play-Doh. I know Future Skills Center has funded some as well, who will take young people, regardless of their background, and train them up for digital jobs that by working with employers. And so I think that for me, one of the real wastes in the Canadian training ecosystem is a lot of organizations are training people for imaginary jobs. They're not working with employers to really understand what is required, and frankly, to push the employers to really think about what skills are required to perform the functions. But we can really, in my view, accelerate the transitions to employment for people from a whole variety of backgrounds. And even though I work at a university, you know, post-secondary education is not the only way in to employment. And I'd be putting a lot of my energy in employer-driven programs, whether, as Pedro says, you know, employers should be investing in those, or whether they need more support. Because remember, in Canada, even though a lot of the discussion of skills that are needed in the labor market and so on is based on surveys of large employers, the banks, the telcos, and so on, they only account for 10% of the private sector jobs in this country. The big gap, and this is something the Future Skills Center is moving into in a serious way, small, medium enterprises, that's where the jobs are. Not just setting up new enterprises, but hiring people in SMEs.
That is fascinating. I wouldn't have thought that the number was that small. I mean, intuitively now that you say it, it makes sense. But that really influences who gets to define that job description, right? That it probably is SMEs. Pedro, if we can take that to sort of the next stage, because I know that the people that are listening in would want to know this. What is your advice to people on how to prepare for the transformations that are about to come?
I'm going to answer your question, but there's something that I just need to mention on the entrepreneurship side. Think about entrepreneurship from a B2B side, right? So yes, the digital platforms will hopefully democratize some of the marketplace on direct to consumer, but a lot of business for entrepreneurs actually comes from other businesses. And procurement can change the world without spending an extra dollar. Because think about the procurement that financial institutions do, universities and colleges, local governments, provincial, federal governments, all kinds of businesses do procurement anyway. And think about if that procurement could actually try and capture the representative nature of, for example, Indigenous entrepreneurs, and ensure that they had access to a market that is becoming increasingly closed because, bids are they're very big. They come in big packages. It's very difficult to hop on that bid. And that means that we keep replicating, right? A lot of who gets business and who doesn't. But with a more intentional procurement strategy, we could actually start to make that DEI lens, the diversity, equity, inclusion lens, real, and start to provide real pathways to business and employment. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
That's actually a really valuable point, because that's how then you start businesses who can then seed other businesses, but they have to kind of get into. And procurement, I mean, there are companies that have been made and continue to make their annual revenues on procurement dollars. No, that completely is a fascinating idea. So you have the last word on our call today. So what is your advice to people listening who are thinking about preparing for this big transformation?
I think about future skills as a three-legged stool, and I would encourage people to think about both in terms of their substantive preparation, but also in how they think about how they're going to communicate that to employers, to think about that three-legged stool. Wendy mentioned number one, which is technological, right? Technological skills. And basic literacy is like basic numeracy and basic literacy. Or I should say, basic digital literacy is the new basic table stakes for any kind of job. And just making sure that you have that and you can communicate that is going to be really important for any job. And of course, the more that you can ramp up those skills, the better. Second bucket, cognitive skills. RBC recently released a report where creativity was put at the top of the list in terms of the kind of skills that are going to be really, really important and are going to set you apart, right? Advanced problem solving, analytical, critical, and creative skills. And ensuring that in addition to all the technical skills that you're going to work on, that you're also thinking about your creativity, stretching your brain, thinking laterally. That's something that employers are increasingly going to be looking for. And the third leg of the stool is what we call social and emotional skills. So adaptability, resilience, collaboration, and more employers are going to be looking for people who walk in through the door and who show that they're lifelong learners, that they're not just stuck in what they did and just telling you about all the things that they've done throughout their lives, that they're actually really leaning in to learning new things, staying ahead of the curve, stretching themselves, and being confident in doing that. Because employers know that their workforce is going to have to continue to change, to learn new things, to challenge each other, and they want people who bring that mindset into the place. So I walk in, like, I got the basic digital stuff. I am creative and a good problem solver. And you know what? I keep investing in my own learning because I know that my job is going to continue to change.
Shamira, can you talk to us about that third-legged stool too? Because you have a perspective on it.
Sure. And maybe what I'll do is I'll call it a triangle, 3 points. So, just building on what Pedro has said around what RBC has talked about and the skills that individuals should have to succeed in our new economy. For me, immigrants already possess all of this just by starting to apply to come to our country. They basically are resilient. They've pivoted their lives to come to a new country and start again. They're problem solvers. They basically have a global orientation. So that's basically, from my perspective, these highly skilled immigrants who come here. Then when I think about what Wendy talked about is work integrated learning. So it isn't just about being in a classroom and learning. It's, how do employers come halfway through with the individuals who have all of these skill sets to be able to really just understand the cultural context from a Canadian lens perspective and what the profession or the occupation is. And then the third component is, if it's about 92, 93% are small, medium enterprises. They're sitting all across the country in smaller communities. So how do we get together in smaller communities with the post-secondary institutions, with the municipalities, with basically employers, and together start building from ground up as to how you integrate the skills of whether it's people who are moving into new occupations because of the pandemic, new immigrants coming in, or young people are just graduating. And I think there's so much opportunity right now as everybody's thinking outside of the box. I just wanted to say that there's a huge opportunity to move forward and leverage the skills of highly skilled immigrants, including refugees, who we make an assumption and stereotype. And Wendy and Pedro know this. Even the Afghan refugees who have come, we all assume, they're coming from camps, etc. Majority are highly skilled. The language proficiency is exceptional. Many are in the health profession. And they could contribute to our economy immediately, as long as we open doors for them. So thanks for asking the question.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's really important to also talk about the stereotypes and how how our perceptions of newcomers or immigrants may also be a problem that we have to deal with. Thank you. And now I have to say something that I usually hate saying at the end of a thought-provoking conversation. That's all the time we have. This was a great conversation. Thank you. Our panelists have been Pedro Barata, the Executive Director of the Future Skills Center, Wendy Sukir, the Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy and founder of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University, Shamira Madwani, the Managing Director and Deputy Executive Director at World Education Services, and Ro Thomas, the Executive Director of the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology. And I want to say you can find, I think, all of them on LinkedIn if you want to connect and sort of take your investigation and your thoughts a little bit further. Thank you, panelists, and to all of you for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of the conference.